Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for your participation in this virtual seminar. Just to begin with, I would like to introduce the Global Strategy Platform. The platform's main objective is the promotion of dialogue and debate through online conferences on current security issues. These events bring together a variety of researchers and practitioners, providing perspectives on regional dynamics, challenges, and opportunities. With this virtual seminar, we are once again open a global strategy platform debate room, Transatlantic Sessions, which will focus on the importance of Atlanticism in a global context. Today's 90-minute session centers on the just concluded Madrid Summit. We will begin the discussion of the new strategic concept of Nato. We are delighted to welcome 4 experts to this topic, namely Admiral James Fogo, Ambassador José Pereira, Professor Paul Dunay, and General Luis Valença Pinto. Our moderator, Professor Fritz Rademacher, will introduce them shortly. Fritz, over to you.
Assis, thank you very much indeed. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Garmisch, the home of the Marshall Center, where we educate, engage, and empower security professionals from across the world. These are indeed historic moments, certainly transformative ones. It is the moment when the liberal democracies and open societies of North America and Europe, together with their like-minded partners across the globe, are taking a stance aggressors and against autocratic leaders who think that their might is giving them the right to break every rule in the book, and who are trying to bring us back to a world that we thought we had overcome. The topic of today's second of the transatlantic session, the Madrid Summit and the strategic concept, are of course very topical, and it is my great pleasure to introduce a group of people who could not be better placed to discuss what these momentous changes mean for NATO. Let me briefly introduce our 4 panelists, and let me start with Admiral James Fogo, who is now the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy in the United States, and someone who had a very distinguished military career, someone who is knowing Europe better than many others, professionally and personally, and somebody who has held senior NATO positions as well. He knows the Middle East, Africa as well. In his last position, where we actually had dealings together, Admiral, in your last position, you were the commander of Joint Forces Naples, JFC Naples, and it was a real pleasure to work with you. Let me move on and warmly welcome General Valença Pinto, who in his last active duty job was the Chief of Defense of Portugal, after a sterling career that also includes a number of integrated positions in the NATO framework, both at NATO headquarters and at SHAPE, I believe. Moving on, it is a particular pleasure for me to introduce Ambassador Costa Pereira, who is currently the Portuguese ambassador to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union, and who has so successfully combined a career in the Portuguese Foreign Service with senior positions both in the Council Secretariat of the European Union and the External Action Service. And last but not least, my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Paul Dunay, who has been a mainstay at the Marshall Center for a long time, and who is both a practitioner and a renowned scholar who has published widely on issues of European and alliance security. With that, let me briefly explain how we want to go through this session tonight. We will have 5 rounds of questions, and we will go through the panelists. And let me start without further ado with our first round. And perhaps I start with Admiral Fogo. The question for our first round is, how will NATO's strategic concept shape the alliance's role in the future? Let me combine this with a specific question to you, Admiral, and that is, were your expectations met when it comes to the outcome of the Madrid Summit and the new strategic concept? Over to you.
Fritz, thank you very much for that introduction and the opportunity to take on the first question with my colleagues. And I would like to say it's very nice to see General Pinto again, sir. Many, many years ago, you hosted me on the Joint Staff Talks, Defense Talks in Portugal and Lisbon, and it was quite a nice event. You were a gracious host, so it's an honor for me to be on the panel with you. Fritz and everyone listening, I have to tell you that the NATO summit in Madrid this year exceeded all of my expectations. And I think that one of the catalysts for a very successful summit was the most unlikely partner of NATO this century, and that is Vladimir Putin. And he drove the alliance closer together. He galvanized the alliance. He consolidated the alliance. You know, one of my favorite jobs in 40 years before I retired was being the commander of what I called the the triptych, or the triple decker of Allied Forces, Joint Force Command Naples for the southern flank, Naval Forces Europe for the United States, Naval Forces Africa. So I got around the area from the high north up in the polar regions down to South Africa, east and west across the Atlantic. And we had many interactions with Secretary General Stoltenberg during that time. Of course, he was very much involved in Trident Juncture up in Norway as a former prime minister, and then one of our best secretary generals in history. He used to say at the meetings, the 4-star meetings in Mons with General Walters and his component commanders, and I was one of them, that NATO's greatest strength is in its ability to adapt. And we saw that with out-of-area operations in places like Afghanistan. We've seen that, and I commanded from Naples and then on the ground in Iraq, the NATO training mission in Iraq, with our first 2 Canadian commanders. And so this summit is no different. We haven't had a strategic concept since 2010. The last one, ironically, was in Lisbon, and I was there as my first 1-star job with Admiral Stavridis as SAC year. Believe it or not, just after that summit, it was a remote convention site out of town. Muammar Gaddafi rolled in for some event that he was having, I think related to the Arab League. And who'd have thunk it, a year or 2 later, we'd be involved in kinetic operations in Libya. So this summit really hit the ball out of the park. Several things. First of all, Russia, the greatest threat to the alliance. No argument about that, especially since the Ukraine has evolved the way it has with atrocities and war crimes. China is now a major focus. That's a big deal. A lot of people said, well, China's not spelled out as an adversary. I think that NATO and the alliance, and that would be the United States included in this, is trying to give China an opportunity to get on the right side of history and not be on the wrong side of history. We have welcomed Finland and Sweden to membership. I didn't think that was going to happen. I'm very happy that President Erdogan, I had a chance to meet him when he was prime minister many, many years ago in Istanbul, came to a compromised position. And those two countries, which I've operated in and been in many times, Baltops, Trident Juncture, they are ready to go. They don't need a PFP plan. They are professional militaries that are ready to go. We're lucky to have them. There was a big emphasis on cyber. And I think the alliance has some work to do there, whether or not a cyber attack is in Article 5. Think about Estonia a few years back. Think about the Colonial Pipeline. Think about the attack in 9/11, which triggered an Article 5. Would a cyber attack do the same thing? Again, we have a lot of work to do. I'm delighted that the President of the United States came to an agreement with the Prime Minister of Spain, and we're going to add 2 more Burke-class destroyers. I brought 4 in while I was 6th Fleet, and later as Navier, I used them all over the theater. It takes 10 transit presence ships to make 4 in a forward deployed naval force. And I lobbied hard to get those 2. And I'm really happy to see that's going to happen by 2024. That's a big deal. Lastly, climate change. I agree. That needs to be a focus for NATO. And in the strategic concept, it's the challenge of our time. And last but not least, many of you know that I'm a huge fan of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, Women in Peace and Security. So the Alliance articulated human security, gender policies, and women in peace and security as being very, very important. And they called out the African Union for the first time. And things we did while I was in Naples was bring FemWise, which is the African Union's version of women in peace and security, together with NATO's women in security. So this movement is moving out smartly, and I'm delighted to see it. Let me stop there and turn to Alex for their comments.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me turn to you, General Valenza Pinto, now. Ask you the same question, and perhaps with the supplement of inquiring a little bit if you think that the new strategic concept has gotten this difficult balance right, the balance, what I call balance between today and tomorrow. In other words, the focus on the current issues, while at the same time not forgetting what might face us in the future. After all, the concept is meant to last for 10 years. The last one didn't even last for more than 4 years. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Well, really, I think that NATO came out of Madrid alive and stronger. We may imagine that this concept will last a decade, but the world is everything but predictable, so we don't know. I think, however, that there are 6 aspects on the concept that deserve a few comments. The first one is the reaffirmation, the right reaffirmation of the values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Yes, okay, no doubt about that. But then NATO has to take into consideration the fact that we'll have to cope with situations existing in, for instance, in Turkey, Poland, and Hungary. The second aspect I would like to mention relates to the core tasks. We now have a new reading of collective defense, now taken as deterrence and defense, associating not only nuclear and conventional dimensions, but also space and cyberspace. And I would like to recall that space will represent a problem to many member states. Again, in the context of the core tasks, there's a change from crisis management to crisis prevention and management. And for me, at least, it's not clear what crisis prevention could be in the context of security and defense. The UN carries out conflict prevention, but that's a complete different thing. And how to carry out such a function as crisis prevention? Via deterrence, via preventive diplomacy? If so, we need to understand that NATO's own diplomatic action is weak, if any. NATO diplomacy is the diplomacy of individual member states. The third aspect, and with this, I do think that in fact there is some imbalance in this concept. The third aspect also relates to COTAX, cooperative security. On this third dimension, I really identify a shortfall. Yes, there are clear references to the United Nations, to the OSCE, and to the European Union, and also to the African Union. But we lose, at least we lose specific references to things such the PFP program, Mediterranean Dialogue, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Arab League. All of them current realities of the NATO action. And when referring to Africa and in recognition of the way the Africans build or try to build their peace and security, I would take as appropriate that maintaining the African Union as a cooperation partner, the same could be said to some sub-regional African organizations, namely ECOWAS, SADC, and IGAD. From my point of view, cooperative security is the weakest bit of this new concept, and to a certain extent shows a shortfall as to the future, going to your question. And it's wrong to believe that addressing it more thoroughly would make the concept less assertive than it should be. The consideration of Russia as the main threat is obviously unavoidable and absolutely correct, real. But it's also positive that, that NATO reaffirmed the availability to communicate, and I insist on the word, to communicate with Moscow when that will be made possible by Russia. The language the concept adopts when referring to China is, on my view, the right one. It's ambiguous, as it should be. China is not perceived as a systemic rival or opponent, and even less as a threat. It's perceived as a challenge. Right attention, in my opinion, is given to the Chinese intention to control essential technological and industrial systems, but to the answer for that, very much overcomes NATO and absolutely requires a due partnership with the African Union and the European Union, at least. Attention is also properly given, I think, to the Chinese current practices of disinformation and of promotion of their illiberal system. This is very important, normally when referring to the Middle East, Northern Africa, and the Sahel region, and not neglecting that the Russian presence and practices are identically negative on those very areas. The clear maintenance of the open door policy, together with the denial of any droit de regard from third parties, is also very positive in my view. Finland and Sweden are making their way, and I believe it will be a very short way, but we don't know the modalities and the timing, but I do believe that Bosnia, Ukraine, Georgia, and quite likely Moldova are also on the track. The question of Moldova goes to two dimensions: the protection of Moldova vis-a-vis Russian eventual aggression, and of course the importance of the Black Sea. NATO at 360 degrees, it has to be well perceived. In my view, NATO could not and should not see itself as a policeman of the world. NATO is a regionally based organization that should be ready and apt to intervene in every part of the globe when the legitimate interests of its member states need to be protected and reaffirmed. So in short, I think, yes, we do have a very good concept, but this concept, in my view, needed to, it was important if it had paid more attention to the dimension of cooperative security. And hopefully the dimension of cooperative security is more present in our future than the other dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to many of the aspects that you have raised. And let me turn now to Ambassador Costa Pereira and ask him what the view from the Justus Lipsius building is when it comes to the decisions taken in Madrid and the strategic concept. General Valenza Pinto has interestingly pointed to the conflict prevention issue, which is obviously also one of the tenets of the strategic compass. So perhaps you could take this into account as well in answering our first question. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all and to those that are listening to us. Difficult to say anything after the interventions of the Admiral first and then the General, because they have really given a good view about the document. The document, of course, as one could expect, is the result of the balances. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we got it at the 8th draft. So, of course, there was plenty of different discussions and debates about words, concepts, ideas, plans. But I think the result is good. At the end of the day, the result is good. Can always find shortcomings. We can always find perhaps some aspects that perhaps were neglected or at least not given sufficient priority. But all in all, I mean, in documents like this, it's always the same all over. Going more specifically to the question you asked me, I think there is a general feeling of happiness, even if I can use the word, about the fact that there was a lot of criticism about what Europe was doing in terms of security and defense, and many criticisms that we were undermining the role of NATO in terms of the collective defense of Europe. And the document is very clear about the way that NATO and EU can relate to each other. It recognizes the efforts made by the EU in terms of security and defense, and this is as complementary to what NATO is doing. And so if you look at the two documents, I would dare to say that I see nothing that is controversial or something that will be conflictual between the two papers. So we are going hand in hand. It's quite a difference from 2 or 3 years ago. It was, well, I guess 3 years ago, that someone was saying that NATO was on his deathbed or something similar. I should say that was cerebral dead, something like that, brain dead. I guess it was brain dead. So things have clearly changed, and as the Admiral said, I mean, probably NATO should start doing some fundraising, crowdfunding, to have a statue of Mr. Putin put into in a veil. Because really he has done more for NATO unity and the unity between EU and NATO than anybody else. She's second in command and probably a smaller statue, at least for the time being. Who knows what the future will reserve us. But it is clear that although the document is certainly a response to the current times, simultaneously, it already shows some of the concerns that most probably will come to us in the future. And so China is there exactly as a challenge, as was said by the General not so long ago, but also other threats that come, although it is really not very much taken into detail, but we can see that there is also concern about what can happen in other areas of the globe, Gulf, Africa, so on and so forth. And there, I would say, because the threats are global, because we cannot just focus on a geographic concept that was at the origin of NATO, our interests now can be affected either in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific or in Africa, and we see that on a daily basis. Therefore, the response has to be global, and NATO, I think, has understand this need to be a global organization without losing, of course, its origins, but with ability to adapt to the different threats. And we live in a world that is very different from the world we imagined about 20 or 30 years ago, and we have to be able to respond naturally to all these challenges, the current ones and the ones that are building up and will be a problem in the future. So all in all, summing up, yes, I think we are going in the right direction, both on the EU side, and now the two are getting even more closer in terms of membership. So not that we want to create a EU caucus within NATO, I wanted to make this very clear, but which I know it's a concern in some areas, but that we can really work hand in hand and develop not only the famous 75 projects, but that we can start sharing other things that are important for the two organizations. I'll probably stop here because I guess in the next round, there'll be more questions around this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I know that you made our American participants very happy with your last remark about the caucus or the lack thereof. But turning to Paul Dunay now, and ask him the same question, plus perhaps his assessment of what the Eastern allies think about the outcome. Over to you.
Although I was not prepared particularly for the Eastern allies, and I have to admit that I'm a citizen of Hungary, a country which is maybe not the best ally of all times, not the most committed, and not the most, not the country that feels most threatened. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with the previous one. But let me briefly mention how I see the situation. The first one is that I see, and there was an allusion to this, that NATO has very strong legitimacy again. I think this legitimacy came back with the able help of Vladimir Putin already in 2014, when after the 2012 Chicago summit, we had some doubts about the future of NATO after the Afghan scaling down, not yet the withdrawal. We see more unity. I think we see more reliance on the United States. The pivotal role of the United States is very much felt. And of course, we feel more European commitment, which is, of course, extremely important. Now, of course, I always emphasize that the US commitment to NATO is absolutely essential. And there, the Eastern allies, particularly those who feel concerned about their security, do not hesitate at all. For them, the ultimate guarantee is coming from the United States. And that's why I find it very important to mention that the US commitment to NATO is absolutely essential for us, and its constant reaffirmation and demonstration. I was part of the Hungarian team in 2010 before the Albright Commission report, and I very well remember that there was one issue that gave this longevity to the strategic concept, the balance between Article 5 and non-Article 5 commitments. And that was what made the 2010 Lisbon concept so happily adaptable, that it was adaptable to every circumstance. It was relevant when we felt Afghanistan was the major issue, and it remained relevant when our Russian friends challenged us so badly. I mean Russian friends, the Russian citizens, and not the Russian leadership, which is by now obviously a non-friend. And of course, we mustn't forget that President Medvedev was traveling to Lisbon in 2010, whereas it's obvious we can't expect anything similar now. What I find very important in this case is, again, not only Article 5 and non-Article 5, but the view of the alliance, which focuses on two types of things. One of them is interstate contingencies, and the other one is security phenomena. Security phenomena ranging from terrorism to cyber, irrespective where it is coming from. And I think I'm very happy about this, because I was a little bit anxious in 2018 when the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, put forward a document which was very much giving emphasis to interstate contingencies, great power competition, and a little bit less to other things, including, of course, terrorism. And if we want to have a lastingly relevant strategic concept, and I think we do have it, we have to keep a balance between these two, because the world is changeable. Unfortunately, in recent times, it was changeable for worse, but let's be optimistic and hope that it will one day be changing for better. Thank you.
Words of wisdom. Thank you very much for that, Pi. Now we have spent about 24 minutes on the first round, and I would be a lousy moderator if I didn't remind the panelists that if we want to get through the 5 rounds, we need to be a touch more concise. With that, let me turn to our second round, which is about the effectiveness of sanctions as a reaction, an effective way. And perhaps that is an issue where I would want to start with you, Ambassador Costa Pereira. In the lead, we have now 6 packages of sanctions, and perhaps you would like to comment on this. But I want to combine this, and I say this also for the others, with a broader question. And that is, what should our future grand strategy towards Russia be? And I think that is a very decisive question for us. But over to you, Ambassador Costa Pereira.
Well, the second question is very large. It will depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers. If the Russian Federation will be exactly the same as it is now, will it implode? What kind of neighbor we will have in the future? But one thing is certain, they will still be there. And we have to find some way that we have to have a dialogue with them. Of course, the dialogue will be of a different nature, according to what Russia will come out of their adventure in Ukraine. And this remains to be seen. So I'm not going to do any futurology here, but of course we need to know if there's still a role for OSCE as a platform for dialogue, and what kind of dialogue do we want to establish with Russia. And it will be different, certainly, if it is a Russia that is a loser or if it's a Russia that is a winner. Now, in terms of the sanctions, usually we look at sanctions as a last resort possibility when everything else was tried, and we did try. And I do remember all the conversations that took place with the Russians, say from November last year up until almost February, without any success, and we could not stay idle, having in mind what's going on. So those are the 6 packages. Of course, they have an impact. Not all the impact is immediately felt. Some of them will only be seen midterm and even perhaps long term, but it has taken a toll on Russia. Did it go up to the point where we would have a mutiny of the Russian citizens that because they could not find products in shops will try to take Putin down? No, not at all. That is not knowing the Russian society at all. So this is not what we had in mind, but we wanted to make clear that Russia will pay a very, very high price for the aggression to Ukraine. And so if the 6 packages are not sufficient, we'll keep digging in. And to be honest, there's already talk about most probably will be a reality about a seven package. As you said, we have little time, so I'll stop here. Although, of course, what your question about the future is very, very interesting, but I hope that certainly the colleagues here in the panel will develop it.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me then turn to you, Admiral Fogo, and perhaps specify a little bit, at least in the NATO context, what I'm thinking about. I'm sure you will have followed very closely the discussions about what to do with the NATO-Russia Founding Act. It was part of the deliberations leading to the new concept, and it is obviously part of the larger question that I raised. With that, let me give you the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fritz. Well, first of all, on the sanctions, these are a crippling set of sanctions, and I've watched each level being levied upon Russia since the 24th of February. And remember, these sanctions were not put into effect prior to the outbreak of hostilities to try not to exacerbate President Putin and to get him to roll his forces back, but that didn't work. Some people have said perhaps it would have been better to go before the outbreak of hostilities and show them the outcome of some of these sanctions. I disagree. I think that diplomacy tried very hard, and when it failed, we levied, what I used to call in this country when we were talking about it early on in February, the mother of all sanctions. I've never seen an economic package like this before. So that said, it only works if everybody jumps on that train, and there are leakers out there. So what we've seen recently is that Russian oil exports have been fairly successful in May, about $20 billion total. Some nations are receiving a 30 to 35% discount on Russian oil. India brought in 800,000 barrels last month and is projected to increase demand to 1 million barrels. That'll keep Russian banks on track. China, of course, had a bad year for the production of wheat. They're buying wheat from Russia and from other sources, but a lot of that wheat is being pilfered from the Ukraine, which has been a food belt for over 100 years. I mean, I couldn't go into it now because of time, but there's been a history of problems with Russian wheat in the Bosphorus since before Gallipoli. So the ruble recently, I think last Friday when I checked, was at an all-time high since May 2015 of about 52.3 rubles to the dollar. The reason for that is that Russia has received a bailout from some nations in the world, China inclusive, India, of course. I think some nations in the world could do better. I started out this discussion by saying NATO didn't paint China as an adversary, but there's an opportunity here for China to get on the right side of history. I don't see how you could trade or deal with a nation that commits this kind of atrocity and war crimes in a country like Ukraine that did not deserve it. I think the Russian economy is feeling the pain. I'm not an economist. I think Pat made some very, very incisive remarks here. And I think if these sanctions continue and there's another layer, that it will continue to hurt Russia and deter their ability to produce war materials to proliferate this war. And that's very, very important. So the nations that are on the bandwagon right now need to stay the course. Those who aren't need to come on board so that we can guarantee the future of Europe's peace and stability. Now, you asked the question, how do we rectify the future relationship with Russia, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the status of Russia formally as an observer at NATO. I've sat in some of those meetings with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. One of my favorite European politicians, because I watched her grow throughout the years, was Angela Merkel. She used to say, there is no Europe without Russia. There is no Russia without Europe. That was before the war in Ukraine. Things have changed now. But, again, going back to Secretary Stoltenberg, he always told me when I walked around with him during Trident Juncture or in the halls of NATO or in our meetings in Mons, deter and defend, the 2 Ds. That's what Sakier always used to talk about. Deter and defend in the Euro-Atlantic region. You're forgetting 1 D, dialogue. Dialogue is important. So if we're ever to get anywhere and try to come up with some kind of a truce and lasting peace and stability, you got to have dialogue with the Russians. They've hurt themselves. There is absolutely zero trust with Russia between the United States and Russia right now, and probably with the majority of most European countries and certainly those who are members of NATO. So this is going to be a real problem and a big hump for us to get over. If Russia finds itself in dire straits because of sanctions, the inability to produce war material or troops to continue the fight in Ukraine, then they may come to the table for peace talks. But the casualties on the Ukrainian side and the loss of Ukrainian soldiers and the continuous flow of war materials concerns me a great deal. And so I am a proponent for getting there faster to the table, although the President of the United States and nobody in the United States has told President Zelensky, hey, you need to move for peace right away and give away any territory. I mean, there's been some commentary on that by Henry Kissinger and others, but the President of the United States hasn't pushed hard for that. Sooner or later, we're just going to run out of material, and we're going to have to sue for some sort of a peace. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And let me turn right away to General Valencia Pinto and ask him for his views. We can't hear you. Can you please unmute?
Sorry, my mistake. I think.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry, my mistake. I'm sorry. I was saying that on this question of the sanctions, my view is somewhat twofold. On the one hand, the effect of these sanctions on the Russian society, it has been, in my opinion, somewhat limited, at least so far. But I do realize that it's very difficult to calibrate these sanctions for three reasons. One corresponds to our own economic and industrial needs, especially in Europe, and especially for some nations in Europe. Certainly not the case of Portugal, but of other nations. The second relates to the indispensable purpose of really affecting Putin and his political and economic entourage. And the third is associated with the need to make the Russian people feel the consequences of its unacceptable leadership, but at the same time do not go beyond a certain level of damage. For humanitarian reasons, yes, of course, but mostly because Putin and Putin's regime future are in the hands of the Russian society, the people, the intelligentsia, the economic tycoons, the armed forces, and so on. But on the other hand, the sanctions have stimulated the West, and namely as the Europeans, to work towards the reduction, if possible, the annihilation of our energy and food dependencies vis-à-vis Russia. And these are good and positive signs, also for the purpose of a better management of the climate change. On the topic of NATO-Russia relations, my view is that somewhere, I don't know when, in the future, these relations, it's important to reestablish them. I was present and I was very much engaged in the negotiations leading to the 2010 concept, and Russia was understood as a very important security partner. To not elaborate more than to give just one example, how can we try to address the question of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction without the alliance, or at least the association of Russia? And there are also other aspects. But in my opinion, at the moment, NATO-Russia relations are even shorter than square one. They are at square zero. And that's absolutely obvious and understandable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Paul.
Yep, thank you so much, Fritz. Let me start by saying that until 24, if not 22 February 2022, there were two major ways of thinking in the West about the Russian Federation. One was saying the Russian Federation is an offensive realist power that is maximizing its power by any means, and basically it's not one of us. And there was another way of thinking which said you can have dialogue, you can have engagement, and Russia is in the end a normal power that can be induced in certain directions and can be disadvantaged in other directions. This came to an end not necessarily on the 24th of February, maybe on the 22nd, when we learned that the Russian Federation claims the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the full territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk areas, where at that time, I think 12 battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces were stationed. As a consequence, I learned at lunchtime on the 22nd of February that war was coming. There was no doubt about it when Dmitry Peskov identified the claim as the full Donetsk-Luhansk Oblast. It's too early to tell how sanctions are going to affect. because as of now, we don't yet see, we have this window when we are still dependent on Russian energy resources. At the same time, we are not exporting too much because sanctions are increasingly preventing us from exporting certain commodities, particularly high value added commodities. This results in this very strong situation for the Russian ruble, which actually is hurting the Russian economy, but that's a separate matter. For the time being, it looks very good for the Russians. If a country is not able to import, but is exporting a lot, this is the consequence that your currency is becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. But this is a window, and this window will be closing as we are going to import less and less, particularly less gas, less oil, less foodstuff. Then it will rebalance. What the lesson of earlier sanctions regimes show is that basically you will continue to be able to export to other partners, but the other partners will take into account the fact that you cannot export to some other partners again. As a consequence, prices start dropping on your export. And at the same time, those who are willing to play the game and export to you things that legally cannot be exported will have a surcharge. As a consequence, and we have seen it with Zimbabwe and South Africa and everybody else, the balance will change, and that is when it will hurt the Russian economy. However, I'm not worried about the trade issue for Russia. And I'm not worried, although I would qualify this, that the Russian people will live with everything. The Russian people did not always live with everything. I was in the Hungarian Foreign Ministry in August 1991, when the Russian people demonstrated that they are not ready to live with everything. It was still the Soviet Union on its deathbed. Where the real problems start is access to technology, investment, and longer-term credits. And the ambassador will be able to tell us for sure that the Russian ambassador to the EU ambassador Chizov, who was already in this function for innumerable years, God bless him, was running around in Brussels after 2014, not claiming that there should be some ease on trade sanctions, but ease on sanctions related to investments and sanctions related to credits, because that's what hurts. And this will hurt the Russian economy because it will lose its competitiveness even more than ever in everything else but natural resources and foodstuffs, so primary commodities. And that is, of course, going to be a lasting tragedy for the Russian Federation. So this temporary advantage should not blindfold us, because in the long run, this will be a very heavy price. And some people in Russia, and some people who left Russia, Anatoly Chubais, who left Russia and moved to Turkey, one of the people who knew the Russian economy best, and the others who are still holding it up, trying to level the consequences so that the consequences would not come imminently, but would come slowly in a manageable way. And Mrs. Nabulina, the president of the Russian National Bank, and Mikhail Mishustin, the prime minister, are certainly doing a reasonable good job on this. But in the end, bearing in mind how much Russia has always been dependent on high value added import and low value added export, the days are counted when the Russian Federation, and unfortunately the Russian people, will severely suffer from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to our third round, which is about how the relations between NATO and the European Union will develop in the future. And this, of course, raises a whole number of important questions, strategic questions, actually, because it relates to the dual dilemmas that both the US and the European Union are facing in terms of prioritizing, balancing interests, in terms of matching aspiration and reality, and many other things. Unfortunately, we are still hopelessly behind time. And so I would ask our panelists to bear with me if I suggest that we limit it perhaps to 2 to 3 minutes for this and the following rounds. Let me start with Ambassador Fogo here, Admiral Fogo here, and perhaps provoke him with a wonderful T-shirt slogan that is floating around these days, and that is that great powers don't pivot. Over to you.
Oh, I subscribe to that. I think that great powers are great powers for a region, and that their reach should be global. And so limiting a reach to one theater or another, in my mind, is not a good policy. And I think we've seen that change. But on the issue of strategic autonomy, I echo my colleagues from earlier that I hope that strategic autonomy is not dead, but that we stop talking about a Western European Union-like military force funded by the EU for Europe. And you remember the WEU was something that was popular back in the 60s and 70s, and it kept coming back. And then we started applying different names. Eventually it got to strategic autonomy. President Macron's been a big champion of that. In fact, you know, quite coincidentally, I wrote a piece for the École Nationale d'Administration's journal last year that challenged strategic autonomy versus putting our money into NATO for military force. I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes. One, when I started up the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub in Naples, Italy, I went to the EU military staff and asked for 2 officers to come to represent the European Union. And it was General Kostarakis, who I met in Brussels, former chief of the military committee of NATO, and then the chief of defense for the EU military staff. And he said, look, I can't give you 2 officers for your staff down there. What the EU can do, though, is we can write a check. We can help you out with projects and things that are developmental in Africa. That was telling and compelling to me. There's a question online from Gunther Rosens about duplication of efforts, and I subscribe to what he says. We don't need 2 of everything. For example, counter-piracy, Ocean Shield for NATO, Atalanta for the EU. Same ships change the badge and go over and run a CP op with the EU flag versus the NATO flag. That's a waste of resources. We don't need a separate standing army for Europe. And I think that this crisis in the Ukraine has proven that NATO is perfectly aligned and perfectly suited to provide deterrence in the Eastern Front. And we don't need to go invent something else. Why do we have 2 innovation funds, one for the EU and one for NATO under Diana? Why can't we all work together? Why can't we work through SACT, the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, a French officer who's supposed to be the clearinghouse for all things innovative and transformational in NATO? So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think that you have to keep in mind that if the United States does take the policy route to pivot yet again to the Western Pacific in light of the perceived threat from China here in Washington, D.C., then the EU will have to pick up, more of the load, and NATO will have to pick up more of the load. And by that I mean you're going to have to pay for more of the defense burden that is not sustained by the rotational force of American forces in Europe. We've got 100,000 troops there right now. That's why I was happy to see those 2 destroyers go over and contribute to maritime security. But will that last forever in light of the pivot, which is where we started this question? I don't know. And there is this window of 2027 where the United States is very concerned that China will make a move on Taiwan. I hope not. I see that Secretary of State Tony Blinken is actually going to meet with Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the G20. He's not meeting with the Russians. So there's something to be said for that. And I think Europe has adopted that policy as well, and not calling China an adversary and designating Russia as the most serious threat. let me stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's only fair if I give the floor next to Ambassador Costa Pereira to provide a viewpoint from Central Brussels. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about what means strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is not Europe building an army to compete with the United States or the rest of the NATO allies. This is completely out of the picture. Strategic autonomy is the conscience in Europe that there are a lot of things that we're missing. Supply chains, we noticed this with the COVID. The ability to protect our citizens wherever they are. NATO might not be interested in doing so. And, you know, this administration of the United States is not exactly as the previous one, which had very little interest, apparently, in some of the European affairs. So this is a response by Europe on the need to be able to protect citizens. It's not the collective defense that here is at stake. Collective defense is a NATO and remains a NATO task, and the Europeans are completely backing up this. Strategic autonomy is our ability to not depending on China on a lot of industrial products that are important, and some of them are of dual use. That's what strategic autonomy means. That does not mean that we cannot and should not be capable of being complementary and working together with NATO. On the contrary, we have one set of forces. And so what we're doing is sometimes we have to use more than one head, depending on the context, depending on the task, depending on the needs. And whatever we do in terms of reinforcing what we're doing here in Europe, would certainly be also positive for NATO as an organization. So let's not confound different concepts. I think this is something that the current American administration has completely understood. The issues of strategic autonomy, of the doubts that existed in the United States about strategic autonomy are a thing of the past. Now we are working, and I do feel that this was completely understood by the current administration. Now, after 2024, well, that's not for me to vote in the American election, so we'll have to see what comes afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me turn to you now, General Pinto. You were, as the Chief of Defense of your country, you were obviously also in charge of defense planning and force planning and so on. Admiral Foggo alluded to this, and some would say, me including, legitimate expectation of the United States is that the European partners shoulder a greater share of our common responsibility in the sense of providing at least 50% of what's needed to deter Russia and to be the first responder in the European neighborhood when it comes to managing crises. How can we orchestrate NATO and EU defense planning in a way that we get closer to this ambition? Over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me start with a very brief comment to say that really I believe that it is absolutely essential that NATO and European Union relations will deepen and strengthen in the future. Accommodating a bigger European strategic autonomy, as understood by our ambassador, NATO-European Union cooperation is instrumental for instance, a United States bigger focus and priority in the Indo-Pacific region, and also for the answer to the challenges and risks coming from the South. And on this, I believe I'm addressing your point. Of course, this requires a bigger European commitment of money and forces, but also requires American trust. And I guess that these two facts are now in place. But again, as the ambassador said, let's hope and wait for 2024 to see what is going to happen. But it is absolutely obvious that the problems that are coming from the southern and eastern periphery of Europe, from the Mediterranean basin by large, will not be coped without European Union involvement, because they call for economic, political, diplomatic, social, financial, cultural intervention, and that's outside the NATO sphere of action. Something else that I would like to, of course, this has to be built, avoiding duplication and even more confrontation or competition. On practical terms, and also going back to your question, I think that there are many things that can and should be developed, especially in the field of defense planning. In 2007, in not the last Portuguese presidency, but before that one, in 2007, we are as close as that to reach that agreement. Germany took the lead, and after Germany came Portugal, and we maintained and sustained the impetus, and we were very close. But in the end, things didn't continue as necessary. But the same can be said as to force extraction, to intelligence sharing, even with some natural limits and reservations, and also with operational planning capabilities. And let me add something else. A sub-product, but an essential one, of a better articulation between NATO and the European Union will be the proper integration of the United Kingdom in the European security and defense dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last point is a very interesting one, and we haven't mentioned that. The latest figures I saw for our audience, and that is before Finland and Sweden became invitees, is that the combined portion of defense spending by the EU European allies is about 20 to 25% of the overall amount. In other words, 75%, perhaps a little less, certainly a little less when Sweden and Finland join, are coming from non-EU allied countries. That is still a reality. But Paul, Dunay, forgive me, I want to ask you a very perhaps unfair and tough question. And you know, we have talked about this in the past. Can Europe on its own balance a belligerent and aggressive Russia?
It would be the shortest answer you would ever hear. The answer is no. The answer is no, because I think our Russian friends feel only be deterred by the United States. And deterrence means two things for the Russians. One of them is the capacity to be able to deter, and the other is the readiness to take actions which deter. And whereas in capabilities, some of the European countries are not hopeless, we do know from opinion polls that the Europeans are less willing to fight. Of course, our resolve has increased, and certainly in some countries, the resolve has increased since February 24, and seeing what Russia is doing to a sovereign country and a nation, which is actually a neighbor of 4 NATO member states. And this must not be underestimated. And of course, our reliance on the United States will continue, and it has to continue, first and foremost in high intensity contingencies. And this deterrence may entail high intensity. And unfortunately, often in other cases as well. I don't want to remind, although it was already mentioned once, 2011, when our French and British friends were going ahead. And then after a while, they said, oh, actually, we can't do too much without the Americans. And we very well remember that President Obama was of the view to lead from behind, lead from the middle. And the US had to come up because it sort of looked inconclusive. So I do think that the US is absolutely essential. there are two more points I would like to make because they cannot come up elsewhere. One of them is this false impression that the division is between new members and old members. And there is somebody today who was already indirectly referred to when the brain dead nature of NATO was mentioned, who was of the view that NATO should not have enlarged to the east. Had NATO not enlarged to the east, we would have similar problems, not a high intensity war maybe, much closer to Western Europe than we have now in Ukraine. As a consequence, I would not like to let anybody get the impression that the Eastern enlargement is a negative sum game. In many cases, take Estonia, take Romania, take Poland, and take a good number of other countries. This is an absolutely essential positive sum game. And there are, of course, countries which are temporarily less committed and less actively engaged. And the next one, the last one that I would like to mention is the 2% issue. I was always very skeptical about capabilities-based armed forces and development, because these countries are democracies. If they don't have to spend on their militaries, or they don't feel the immediate need, they will spend elsewhere that brings more votes, education, infrastructure, social services, and so on and so forth. And I think nothing but threat is bringing this back to us, that now we all know what is at stake, and it's not naming and shaming that helps us unite and spend much more on our defense because we feel that it is existential. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That leads us nicely into our next round. It is about actually, if you will, it symbolizes the interconnectedness and concurrency of the challenges we are facing. And so with this feeble way of introduction, I'm trying to start the discussion on China, including the thorny question of Taiwan. And I would also like to point out that we had a question in the chat relating to the China, the Sino-Russian relationship, which I think has to be viewed in a nuanced way, but there are certainly trends here. And given that this is also about Taiwan, I think the first shot should go to the Navy. And let me call on you, Admiral Fogo, to take that on, please.
Well, thank you. And I note that in the strategic concept paper, which is very concise, tight, well-written, there is no mention of Taiwan. Obviously, that's a very sensitive subject for the United States, for the Taiwanese, and also for China. And you've seen recently, there's been some perturbations in the force. A few weeks ago, President Biden was asked if Taiwan was attacked, would you come to their defense? His answer was yes. And then at the NSC and the State Department, over the course of about a week to 10 days, that answer was kind of rolled back. I did a podcast with my old boss, Admiral Harry Harris. Many of you remember him. He was the 6th Fleet Commander, later the PACOM Commander, and most recently the last U.S. Ambassador to South Korea. And on that podcast, I asked Harry about that comment. He goes, hey, you know what? Somebody should listen to President Biden, because since he's been in office, he's made that same statement 3 times, and somebody's come along and rolled it back. Maybe we ought to believe him and not the rest of government. So I think there is a penchant there for the United States to want to deter aggression against Taiwan, as we are trying to do with our NATO friends and allies and with the EU in Ukraine. Nobody wants a hostile takeover. I mean, the Chinese have made the statement that eventually there will be assimilation of Taiwan under the One China policy, which the United States has observed by 2049, on the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. There's also statements made by the former commander of Indo-PACOM that will be accelerated to a time frame before 2027. That's what's driving the pivot And if it's accelerated to before 2027, the likely outcome is that will be a hostile act of a takeover. So I think there's a lot of distance between where this strategic concept goes and where the U.S. position is vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. We see probably more of the aggressive acts in the Western Pacific than perhaps Europe does. Some European countries, for example, France, have a big presence out in the Indo-Pacific. We'd like to see more of that come from NATO, but resources are pretty strapped and pretty thin right now with the war effort going on in Ukraine. So, like I said earlier, Secretary of State Blinken is going to meet with the foreign minister at G20 from China, Wang Yi. And let's hope that that third D that Stoltenberg talked about, dialogue, will prevail here. It should be not lost on the Chinese that the guests invited to this strategic concept in this summit in Madrid included Asian Pacific guests, so Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. The recent reinforcement of the Quad, although there's been some differences with India, and the stand-up of AUKUS are signals to China that take a look around and see who your friends are. When you count on your friends as being Russia and North Korea, you might want to think twice about being on the wrong side of history. And back to you, Fritz. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, General Pinto, and quote Stoltenberg as well, who very much liked to say that we were not moving to the Asia Pacific. It was China that was moving closer to us. Obviously, from a European perspective, this is a very complex relationship. There are trade interests, there are security interests, there are other interests. How do you think Europe should and can manage these differing interests?
Well, I think that it is the options made to China in the concept are, in my opinion, right and positive. I think that our overall aim should be to try to bring China to a global normative attitude in a rules-based international system, obviously recognizing China's say on the identification of these norms and of its possible limits and variants. And on this aspect, a convergent attitude of both the United States and the European Union would be fundamental. Chinese influence is another story. I have already mentioned the Chinese rhetoric and disinformation campaigns, namely on our European periphery. It is indispensable to answer to that with a Western, more obvious and more committed presence on those areas. And when I say Western, I mostly imply European, but not only. Translated by the willingness to cooperate with the local actors, obviously ensuring due ownership to the local authorities for all these policies. And another aspect, and I think this is very, very important, is the opposition and certainly the control to the economic and technological dominance that China seeks. To a large extent, we can identify that, or we can associate that with the Belt and Road Initiative. NATO doesn't have the means to oppose to that. The European Union is, for that purpose, of an absolute value and a potential key player. And the same goes to the African Union. Allow me to recall that China and the African Union signed an agreement and a program to ensure compatibility between the Belt and Road Initiative and the African Development Program 2063. So there is lots of things that can be done. Taiwan is a different issue. First of all, I think it is important to recognize that Taiwanese population and thus its leadership is today quite different in motivation than their predecessors that went to the island 70 years ago with Chiang Kai-shek. I believe that it is still possible for both sides to return to the principle of one country, two systems. envisaging the reunification in a non-determined, but certainly not immediate future. My major hesitation on this goes to the fact that, as we all know, President Xi Jinping is now the permanent ruler of China, as he defined himself. And my concern there is that this could develop is a dream on him, on President Xi Jinping, of entering on the Chinese history as the unifier of the nation. That would be very problematic and will go quite beyond all presences that we can imagine from Western powers in the area. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. And that gives me a nice way of moving over to you, Ambassador Costa Pereira. Both of the previous speakers mentioned the importance, if not necessity, of very close US-EU relations when it comes to the management of China's rise. And perhaps you can touch on this aspect as well. Over to you.
This would be a very long conversation and we don't have time to do it. So I'll try to be short. China is an aspiring great power. As every aspiring great power, they define themselves vis-a-vis what is the great power of the moment. The great power of the moment being the United States. What China wants is to create a wedge between the United States and possible allies. That's what they're trying in Europe. That's what they're trying in Latin America. That's what they're trying in Africa. Then, of course, unity of purpose between the United States and NATO, European Union and the United States is paramount. I think we have done our own work, and although we understand that in some areas, say climate change, we have to cooperate with the Chinese, illegal traffic and so on, we see it more and more as a systemic rival, in the sense that China is now developing a narrative of an alternative global society. And this is a narrative that is not ours, that is not based on our values, is based on their view of the world. And we do not feel comfortable with their view of the world. We don't want to create in Europe a huge Xinjiang, do we? So we have to be able to resist this, which is not an easy task, because China is, as I said, an aspiring power that would probably be in about 20 years or so in parity with the United States. Let's see. Things can evolve, can change, but indeed they are now someone that we have to be very careful the way we deal with China, and we have to understand this assertiveness, this buy-in of the international organizations to try to distribute or diffuse this narrative is very risky. In the case of Indo-Pacific, well, I don't know. I mean, the admiral knows more about than this, but I believe that this is a very, very tough operation for the Chinese to occupy Taiwan. It's not something that will be done easily. And so they have to really balance if they are ready to do it. It is true that the rhetoric is this one, as the general just said. She certainly wants to leave some kind of heritage, his own legitimacy as a great leader on China. But then let's not forget that Xi's position is perhaps less comfortable than we sometimes believe. The Chinese are not as, there are a lot of different opinions within the Chinese Communist Party, which is the source of power, and we have to check to which extent Xi can really be able to convince the others about his ideas. So they don't have many friends. The admiral is absolutely right. I mean, I don't think that the Philippines or the Vietnamese or the South Koreans or the Japanese are comfortable with China at all in the neighborhood. They're trying, and we see now they're trying to do something with the Pacific Islands, but clearly they start to feel that there is a containment in Indo-Pacific, which they believe it was their playground before. And this is something that makes them very uncomfortable. To which extent this would provoke a reaction of trying to show force because they've been a bully over there remains to be seen. But it would be important to bring a country like India which is, I would say, is a key player over there. And India that understood now that they cannot contain China by themselves. And so they're much more open to cooperation with us and to the United States. In the United States, it already started about a decade ago. I remember when I was in Washington, all these conversations with India about the nuclear and the way that the administration of George Bush Jr. treat the Indians. So we see the Indians as a very important ally in this confrontation, this possible confrontation in the future. If it will not be a war, let's hope so. But if a war starts, I'm certain it will be in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Paul, over to you now. And perhaps you could comment a little bit on this question of the Sino-Russian relationship as well.
Thank you very much, Fritz. The Sino-Russian relationship, I think, is held together by their shared and declared rejection of the current international system as they perceive it. And I hope that everybody understands why I emphasize this. As they perceive it, there is not much else that holds them together. To tell the truth, for China, this war came at a very bad moment. It did not want to have an interruption on its so-called peaceful rise or harmonious development, and Russia blew it. And of course, Russia creates a problem with BRI, I mean the land BRI connection, which is bad. The rising prices of grain and certain commodities is also not good news for China. Imagine that you have to feed 1.4 billion people and not, let's say, my country, 9.6 or something like that. So the second thing is that we are more alerted to China's behavior than before. Our American friends were ahead of us. We Europeans were sort of hesitant. And then when Xi Jinping visited Paris, I think it was about 3 years ago in March, and then Emmanuel Macron said that China was living on Europe's naivete, which was a very strongly formulated message to China that business as usual will not continue. Let me mention one more thing before we go on. I hope that it's in all our interest, is that here we are going to see a more structured division than in many other cases. It is the US and the few large powers of Europe that can demonstrate and pursue interests beyond its own region, which is by and large Europe. So the British, the French, to some extent the Germans are going to go along. Others will go along in the verbal reassurance, and where they can contribute is to take more care of other issues while the big players are dealing with issues which are outside of the scope of the Washington Treaty in formal sense. And that's, of course, an absolutely essential differentiation. And here I go back for a moment to 2015 or 2016, when the Rand Corporation published a study and indicated that basically it's about 5-6 countries in NATO which really matter militarily. The others matter with a number of other things, sometimes even surprisingly. I just would like to remind, as a good Hungarian who has nothing to do with the current government, I want to emphasize that we sent a transport battalion to Afghanistan that everybody said, oh, it doesn't matter, it's low intensity. And then it turned out to be one of the most risky jobs in Afghanistan, because it meant that you had to be on the road outside of your own compounds. So other allies, I think, if they can't help with the actual implementation of policy in the Far East, can certainly help with contributing elsewhere and liberating some actors to act more forcefully, if necessary, in the Far East, in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I obviously failed miserably in managing the time, but I think we would be really amiss if we didn't touch on the last issue of the evening, which is how states in the global south, not aligned with NATO, will shape the global strategic context in the future. And I would ask our esteemed panelists to be as concise as they can. But this is really a big issue. People have noted what's in the strategic concept on the South. People have noted that an entire session of the summit proceedings was dedicated to the South. But at the same time, we all understand, and some of us have worked in the area, how difficult it is within the alliance to come up with a viable strategy for the South. So perhaps I start with you, General Pinto, and ask you for your comments.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let us be clear. South is far more than Northern Africa and the Sahel region. South is sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, some parts of Asia, and so on and so forth. And the role that they can play, perhaps it's not very easy to find a perspective for them to adopt. The importance is, what can we do with them and for them? And that's the key point on my view. We do need to have a real willingness to cooperate through regional and sub-regional organizations where they exist, but of course also obviously bilaterally. Understanding cooperation as a two-way street and avoiding assimilating cooperation with neo-dominance through the full recognition and respect to the principle of local ownership of the decision-making process. It is perhaps true that on an initial phase that this needs to be performed to contradict China influence and to a less extent also Russian influence. But in the long run, and it will be the long run that will shape the future, it will be the needs and requirements of the populations that will have to move our efforts. For this purpose, I think that paying due attention to the 7 dimensions of human security as identified by the UN seems to me to be a good guide. Human security is an essential component of cooperative security, and that justifies my concern with what I believe it's a relative diminishing of the importance given to cooperative security on the new NATO strategic concept. To be short, my opinion is that not recognizing the importance of cooperative security, means a lack of understanding of the global realities of our time. And this perhaps answers your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn over to Ambassador Costa Pereira. If I'm not mistaken, you have actually in your distinguished career also worked on Africa in the one or other guise. And it's of course, obviously also not only a challenge, but also a responsibility for the European Union to engage in the South and for the South. So what are your views?
Well, I think the European Union is engaging in the South, been engaging in the South for quite a number of years. If it's engaging the right way, that is the question. Apparently not, since the results have not been extraordinary. And I think we have to do some self-criticism about the way we've been doing. I believe our biggest mistake, and I'm speaking personally, I'm not here exposing the views of my country, but speaking personally, I think our biggest mistake is that we try to build African societies that will be a mirror of our Western societies. And this is not working properly because the economic, social, and political context is rather different. But all our development policy has been trying to actually support states and try that those states can provide the same kind of services that the states in Europe or the United States provide to their citizens. And it's not working for several different reasons. And so we see a massive transfer of people's aspirations from the normal democratic playing into radical movements that then can be either inspired or used by religious confessions. And so we have this huge problem of terrorism. It's not just Sahel, it's also Central African Republic, it's Congo, is building up on the west part of Africa, is already in the eastern part of Africa, and now coming to the south, as we can see in northern Mozambique. So we have a real problem here in our hands. And if we do not change the way we do development, which is very important in the sense of not sustaining governments that are corrupt, that are weak, that at a certain stage are being actually taken away by military coups that incredibly are popular with the populations because they are tired of having leaders that are not capable of really leading, it's not going anywhere. I mean, we can send, and we did our operations, we train people, we try to put a kind of approach that is inclusive by bringing together security, development, humanitarian support, but we need to do better. In terms of Latin America, which is also South, I think we need a strategy for Latin America. I must say that our allies in the United States in particular have not been very, very active, neither in Latin America nor in the Africa, that they do not seem to consider a priority nowadays. And so China has been occupying its space. Russia has been occupying its space with the different entries, but still both of them are, of course, a problem because they are not beneficial for neither Africans nor Latin Americans, but there is competition over there. So we need to be more strategic in our approach to Latin America. We cannot remain hostages of not signing the trade agreements and the association agreements with Mexico, Chile, and the Mercosur. We need to do things with them. We are working on that, and I hope that we can really make progress over there. The South in itself is very difficult for them also to be a powerhouse. We could see what the Chinese are trying with the last summit of the BRICS, and we can see that there's clearly resistance, that it goes beyond being an economic collegiality to be something more than that. The differences are huge over there between South Africa, India, Brazil, China, and basically what the South wants is to be respected in their autonomy. They certainly try to be as equidistant as possible for everybody else. For them, the Ukraine war is a war of the whites, let's be very frank about it, and that they are paying the consequences of this because of the famine, because of the difficulties they have in terms of supplies of food. So they see it that again they're paying the price of what the West is doing, and this is a narrative that is used by the Russians and to a certain extent by the Chinese, and we have to be able to have a counter narrative, and we have to also, again, here, be a little bit better than we are in terms of communication. And I stop here, otherwise I'll be speaking for another half an hour or so.
Thank you very much. It was very fascinating. Admiral Fogo, if you were to put on the three hats again today, what would you do differently?
Well, is this related to the South
Yeah.
question? Yeah. So, you know, that was Secretary Stoltenberg's baby, and he drove the establishment of NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, and he put it in my headquarters. I took it to full operational capability. Did some homework first. First of all, I remembered General Ward, the first commander of AFRICOM, telling me when he went to Africa for the first time, he said, "This is my AOR," typical American with an acronym, right? Area of responsibility. The African leader said, "Whose responsibility, General? Yours or ours?" I never forgot that. So I did my own straw polling. And I'll tell you this, the biggest problem for me is I'm in Naples looking south, down, and I'm a naval officer. It's a point of the compass, but there is no standard definition for south. You heard it today. The ambassador hit the nail on the head. If you ask a Brazilian, a Portuguese, a Spaniard, a Moroccan, or a Turk what the definition of the south is, you get lots of different definitions. And so I had to kind of expand my horizon to include Middle East, North Africa, Sahel, and beyond. And of course, South America is involved there too. The only way to do, and I was disappointed, the hub in NATO Strategic Direction South was not mentioned in the strategic concept. What it said was NATO has shared security threats in Sahel and MENA. So you're right, Ambassador, there is kind of a lack of interest, certainly here in the United States and Africa, and I think that's a huge mistake. Others, the Russians and the Chinese, are taking advantage of that. General Pinto hit the nail on the head when he started this discussion earlier on Africa, that the way to work with the Africans, and keep in mind the General Ward comment, whose responsibility? It's their responsibility, African solutions to African problems. And that goes throughout the South if you take it to the Middle East as well, or even in the Maghreb and North Africa. You got to find those solutions. And the key is the African Union. I agree with my friends in Portugal on this. I still keep in touch with Admiral Mello, the fleet commander, who was a counterpart, and through him to Admiral Ribeiro, the Chad. That's really important. And as we developed a relationship with the African Union, and this strategic concept document was the first one to mention the African Union, there's some key players down there. Smail Cherki, the commissioner, who worked with us on a memorandum of agreement. I wish we could have expanded that even further. Commissioner Josefa Sacco for the blue economy and climate change came to the headquarters in Naples, and we tried to help develop an early warning center for Africa. There's a lot of work that could be done down in Africa to offset what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. The Russians in Libya with Wagner Group, the Chinese using lawfare and economic debt warfare along the lines of Sri Lanka, who lost the port of Hambantota to try to pay off some of the interest on their debt. We don't want that to happen in the Gulf of Guinea, and we need to be more involved. So I would, if I had to do it again, I'd push harder on the South. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, famous last words.
Brief last words, because I don't want to make myself even more unpopular than I am anyway. There was one thing that we did not mention, and that's of course not NATO. When we have so many strategic issues on NATO's plate, whether it is not an overstretch to deal extensively with the South, and I raise one question: there will be food shortage, there are environmental problems, and the migratory pressure on Europe will be on the increase. And then, of course, we will pay a price that already in 2015, some countries were reluctant to go into a more responsibility sharing behavior that would have helped and would help us. And rather than doing that, people are making just excuses, presenting them on CNN yesterday, just to mention one, rather than recognizing that there is some kind of solidarity which goes with our value system, rather than this kind of fragmentation of national interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And with that, let me thank all of you who so actively and aptly contributed to what I think was a very rich discussion. And it is really a pleasure and a privilege for me to have been part of it. And with this, let me turn over to poor Colonel Bernardino, who has waited so patiently. The floor is yours.
Professor, thank you very much. We are running out of time, but anyway, just give me a brief final notes and final comments. So we know that the world is changing dramatically since the NATO agreed to the last strategic concept at the Lisbon Summit in 2010. Our security environment has become more challenging, more dangerous, and also much more unpredictable. The 2022 NATO strategic concept set out a shared vision of the threats, the main challenge, and opportunities that NATO will face now and maybe in the near future. The new concept supports the alliance to continue adapting in a more critical and competitive world. As we saw from our guests today, the strategic concept is a key document for the alliance, is important for the security Euro-Atlantic, and also relevant for the global security. It reaffirms main values and intentions and provides a collective assessment of the security environment. It also drives NATO's strategic adaptation and guides its future political and military development. Now, let me summarize and share three main ideas in 3 minutes. First, NATO strategic concepts fulfill 3 core tasks. We mentioned today deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and also cooperative security. These three core tasks are complementary and essential to ensure the collective defense and security of all allies. Ensuring national and collective resilience, enhancing the alliance's technology edge, and fulfill integration, climate change, human security, and women, peace, and security agenda across all over NATO work are all part of the complementary alliance three core tasks. Second, the Euro-Atlantic security is challenged by a strong strategic competition and persistent global instability. The Euro-Atlantic is not at peace at the moment. The Russian Federation brutal war aggression against Ukraine has broken peace in Europe and will be in the near future one of the most challenging agenda. Russia has violated the norms and the principles that contribute to a stabilized and predictable European security order. It poses maybe the most significant and direct threats to the alliance strategy and security, and also for the peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. China's stated ambitious and cohesive policies challenge our interests, our security, and our values. And also because of that, allies will work together to address the systemic challenge posed by China to the Euro-Atlantic security. They remain open to a constructive engagement with a view to safeguarding the alliance security interests and building reciprocal transparency. So we have also a new interest and a new order, and also terrorism remains a persistent threat and is maybe the most direct asymmetrical threat to our citizens, to our security, and also to NATO. We are also facing a number of other global and interconnected threats and challenges like we saw today, like cyber, like space. And we saw today that from our guest speakers that we have many challenges in face of our, in the near future. And three, and last point, NATO key purpose and greater responsibility is also to ensure the collective defense of alliance. And as we know, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Threats is the backbone of Allied collective defense. The North Atlantic Council could decide to invoke it to respond to armed attack, and a single or cumulative set of malicious cyber activities like hostile operations from and with space, hybrid operations against allies could reach the level of armed attacks and could lead the North Atlantic Council to invoke the Article 5. We hope not. The alliance is based on assurance and enduring strategic connections between Europe and North America. And as in conclusion, NATO remains the unique, essential, and indispensable transatlantic relations to consult, coordinate, and act as all matters related to alliance security. So that was my final remarks. Thank you very much. And now hand over to Professor Sismalakias to close the sections. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
I just to thank you all, and I promise that we'll do it again. Thank you.